Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at indicators 2.2 and 2.3. We just got through going over 2.1, which was all about expansionism. Now we're going to look at some other things that are going to occur during the mid to early 1800s. So let's look at those standards real quick. 2.2 it says to explain how the Monroe Doctrine and the concept of manifest destiny affected the United States' relationships with foreign powers, including the role of the United States in the Texan Revolution and the Mexican War. 2.3 deals with compare the economic development in different regions, the South, North, and West, which we're going to talk about, of the United States during the early 19th century, including ways that economic policy contributed to political controversy. So those are our two standards. You might want to write those two down and see if you could possibly answer them after going through this video lecture. Let's look at our first slide, and our first slide is going to be about the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine, you need to make sure that you write down Monroe Doctrine as your heading, which for some reason I didn't put a heading on here. But anyway, you want to write Monroe Doctrine down. And the key point of the Monroe Doctrine was that they were mainly trying to keep the European powers from trying to restore former colonies in the Western Hemisphere. The guy that's going to introduce this, of course, is going to be President Monroe, and he's going to issue this warning to the Europeans to say basically that you should not interfere in the Western Hemisphere, and if you do, then the United States would consider it an act of aggression, and they would be willing to go to war. So that was the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe issued it. It was after the War of 1812 when the Monroe Doctrine was issued, and of course, the United States felt really good because they just defeated Great Britain, who was a major world power. And this is also referred to, this period is called the Era of Good Feeling. So this is the first chance that the United States sort of gets its opportunity to exert itself in this time period. Now, because of this era of good feelings, we're going to get a period of what we would call nationalism. And of course, nationalism means pride and love for one's country. And the idea of manifest destiny is starting to take hold, where people believe that it is our God-given right to take all of the land from sea to sea, which we just got through talking about, and that the United States should continue to expand and take on wars over land. So the United States is exerting itself. This nationalist period is after the War of 1812. We're starting to expand as a country, and we're beginning to take land, and we're willing to go to war over that land if we have to. So nationalism, again, big concept during the early 19th century. Next, let's talk a little bit about the Texas Revolution. The Texas Revolution occurs. Americans have been traveling into Texas to get really cheap land that Mexico was offering. These land grants were being offered up, and they were sold cheap to Americans moving there. Texas, if you didn't know this, is really good for growing cotton. And of course, with the cotton came the institution of slavery as well. The one condition that the people had to make with Mexico was that these Americans moving into this new land would have to obey the laws of Mexico, not the United States, because it's Mexican land. So this is where this Texas Revolution is going to get its start. Later on, Mexico would outlaw the institution of slavery, and the Texans are going to revolt because cotton, of course, was a major deal in Texas. The Texans are going to revolt, and they're going to win their independence from Mexico. And this is when we have the Alamo, which you see pictured up here on the left. a group of Texans, along with Davy Crockett, are going to try to stand up against the Mexican army. They're highly outnumbered, and they're going to be defeated pretty bad, only to have Sam Houston and Stephen Austin come back and eventually defeat the Mexican army and win this revolution against Mexico, and they become their own independent country. The problem was that Mexico didn't recognize that Texas had independence even after they win this revolution. So the Republic of Texas would be formed. It's going to be a totally separate country from the rest of the United States as well as from Mexico. That's why it's often referred to as the Lone Star Republic. And if you've never noticed their flag, it has that one single star on it. The United States would not add Texas initially because they knew that they couldn't add a slave state at that time. And it would have created an issue between slave states versus free states. But 10 years later, Texas would be annexed by President Polk, and America is going to absorb Texas. And then the issue is going to be whether Texas should be a slave state or a non-slave state. The Mexican-American War occurs in the mid-1800s. 1845, President Polk is going to want to have more land. Here's President Polk over here on the right. Of course, this is, again, the idea of manifest destiny, to get this land in between the two oceans. He offered to purchase the land from Mexico, and Mexico is going to decline. So President Polk's going to send troops in to survey disputed lands such as California and New Mexico. Mexico saw this as a hostile act, and they are going to fire shots at these surveyors and troops that went into these areas, these contested areas. And of course, here they are, right here and here. And of course, this is going to lead to issues with Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which we talked about in the last lesson, was the land that the United States would gain after going to war with Mexico and defeating them. That war, I believe, goes from 1845 to 1848. And all of the land that you see here in red is going to be all of the land that the United States would gain after the Mexican-American War. Later on, we would get this small section down here just below that land, which is the Gadsden Purchase. We would buy that small portion of land for $10 million from Mexico, and we considered that as compensation also for the other land that we had took from Mexico, which is California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, which we all got from Mexico during the Mexican-American War. So the U.S. got more land from Mexico than the Louisiana Purchase. All of this land is actually more land than what we had gotten in the Louisiana Purchase. If you look at your map, you might want to go ahead and label this. This line is going to show you the Mexican Cession, which is all of this land, including California. The line below would be the Gadsden Purchase. You definitely want to label it. And then, of course, all of this land was the land that was gained from the Texas Revolution, which would later be annexed by the United States from Mexico. So please make sure that you know where these areas are and you understand where they are on the map. That's going to do it for 2.2. Again, before we leave 2.2, make sure that you understand where these pieces of land were on the map and that you know how we obtained them. Let's look at 2.3. 2.3 is dealing with regional differences. Again, what is sectionalism? And of course, sectionalism is where the country is going to be divided up into different sections based on their beliefs about certain areas. But again, it means identifying with a region rather than the nation as a whole country. That is sectionalism. And you can see how the U.S. was sort of split up between the West, the North, and the South. If we look at the North, here's some of the main things that you need to know that was going on with the North. In the North, you had rivers, you had transportation and shipping that were very prominent in the North. You had the building of the Erie Canal, which is going to allow a lot of goods and products to flow from the Atlantic into the Great Lakes, and this is going to be built during this period, early period of the 19th century. Remember, the North is going to be big in industry and finance. A lot of the money that is made in the North is going to be invested into factories, and a lot of people are going to start to move there. So this area is going to attract a lot of immigrants due to the industry and the amount of jobs that are going to be being created during this period. Mainly the immigrants that are coming to the North during this time period are going to be Germans and Irish. The North supported public education, and a lot of the immigrants that moved to the North began to assimilate with the rest of the U.S. citizens in those areas. And like we talked about in the last lesson, the North is going to support tariffs on imports. And remember, a tariff is a tax, and they were taxing these imports that were coming from Europe. So this is going to play a major role for the North in helping them not have competition from these European countries. Let's look at the South. In the South, they're mainly going to invest into the institution of slavery and agriculture. One of the major inventions during the late 16th century is going to be the cotton gin. The cotton gin is going to come out around 1793. Eli Whitney's going to invent the cotton gin, and the cotton gin is going to increase slavery in the South because naturally they've got this thing that can pick those seeds out of the cotton a lot faster. And so the production of cotton is going to explode during this period, and the South is going to be relying on cotton during the early 1800s. The South didn't have a lot of public education, and like we said in the last lesson, they were opposed to the tariffs. Most of the rich, wealthy landowners or plantation owners are going to dominate all of the government during that period. And there weren't a lot of jobs to attract immigrants. So most of the immigrants, again, moving up north to get those jobs in the factories and the industries. And they opposed the idea of a national bank. And the South wanted to have state banks because they thought the state banks could offer cheaper loans than a national bank. So that's the South. Let's look at the final region, which is going to be the West. And in the West, there's going to be a lot of new resources that are going to emerge. These resources are going to be other ways for people to sell and make money. One of them is going to be mineral deposits. Eventually, some of those mineral deposits are going to be gold. Gold will be found, which we talked about a couple lessons ago with the California Gold Rush in 1849. A lot of people are going to begin to move westward and start to settle in these new states. The West was opposed to a national bank. They saw it as uncontrolled. So much like the South, they did oppose the national bank too. And most of these states out west are going to be agriculturally based, but they knew that having this agricultural based economy could actually benefit from slavery. So they weren't necessarily totally opposed to slavery because they did have some areas that were highly productive as far as agriculture went. So slavery, again, not necessarily ruled out in the West. The next thing up here is the Missouri Compromise, and this occurs in the 1820s. Again, the argument of slave states versus free state is going to come up when Missouri wants to enter into the U.S. Missouri, it wants to enter as a slave state, but they knew that it would upset the balance in Washington and in the Congress. So Henry Clay, who's often referred to as the great negotiator, is going to negotiate a compromise, which is going to be the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri would come in as a slave state and Maine, and that should be Maine with an E, as a free state. A line is going to be set at 36 degrees 30, and in this line, or anything below or above, or anything below this line is going to be a slave state. Anything above this line to the north is going to be a free state. So the Missouri Compromise sets the line at 3630. Anything to the north would be free. Anything to the south would be slave states. Looking at the American system. The American system was also introduced by Henry Clay. He was the great compromiser. Henry Clay is a senator in Congress. He's going to propose a couple of different things, but one of the main things is that he wants to try to help the U.S. economy become independent. And this is going to be the American system. In the American system, this included a few different things. One of them included the higher tariff, which means you're going to have a higher tax. You're also going to see internal improvements, such as canals and roads being built. You would also see the national bank become very strong under the American system. But due to sectionalism, the West and the North are going to side against the South because of some of the things that they believed in. And so the American system, again, was a way to try to help make America competitive and to help make their economy a lot stronger. And of course, these are some pictures of the Erie Canal, a little bit about how these home industries and people can start making and producing things and selling them due to not having to worry about imported goods. So again, the American system, make sure you understand it, and let's move on. So we saw infrastructure begin to grow. When we talk about the infrastructure, we're talking about roads, canals, bridges, and so forth, which are going to start to appear during this period. Infrastructure are physical necessities for a country to prosper, like roads and canals and bridges and so on. That's what infrastructure is. You definitely want to write that down. The Erie Canal was built during this period. It connected the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Erie, so it gave them a way to travel from the Atlantic into the Great Lakes. It was huge for shipping, especially for the Western territories who were starting to produce and make things. Now things could flow from west back to the east. It created a growing relationship between the North and the West, but not necessarily the South, because, again, the Erie Canal is going to help those two areas, but not the South. The National Road was going to be built during this period. This connected the East Coast to the new territories, and we're going to see this was the first national federally funded highway, and it was completed in the 1830s. And here it is, you can see right here, basically through most of the Ohio River Valley, leading from West Virginia all the way into Illinois. So again, the National Road built in the 1830s, all part of the infrastructure that was being done during this period. And that's going to conclude our lesson. You definitely want to go back and make sure that you review some of these things, such as how did the infrastructure improve during this period of the early 1800s. You also want to know what the American system was, so make sure that you explain that. You might even want to write these questions down at the end of your notes. Understand what happened with the Missouri Compromise. Remember, Missouri was allowed to enter in as a slave state. Maine was added as a free state, and then a line was drawn at 3630. Make sure you know that Henry Clay was the guy that proposed the Missouri Compromise. You want to know how the West was different from the North and the South, and some of the main things that came out of the West. You want to know the differences of the South and some of its major production and what the South was all about during this period. And you want to know about the North as well, making sure you understand how the Northern economy was shaped. You also want to make sure you write down what is sectionalism and you explain the definition for sectionalism. And again, it's identifying with a region rather than the nation as a whole country. Going back to 2.2, understand how we got the land known as the Mexican Cession, how we ended up with the Gadsden Purchase, and how the Texas Revolution is going to add Texas to the United States. Understand the Mexican-American War from 1845 to 1848. The treaty that ended it was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It's going to add most of the southwestern portion of the United States. And again, that's a big, big deal. This was more land than the Louisiana Purchase. Know that James K. Polk was for Manifest Destiny, and he is going to sort of spark this Mexican-American War when he sends in surveyors and troops to check out parts of California and New Mexico. Understand the Texas Revolution and how Texas would fight against Mexico to win their independence. And Texas would be an independent state during this period in the mid-1800s, and Texas was known as the Lone Star Republic during that period. Again, and I didn't talk about this, but you want to know about Santa Anna. He was the leader of the Mexican army, especially early on when they fought at the Alamo, and he would later be defeated by Stephen F. Austin and Samuel Houston, and they would defeat Santa Anna's army and help Texas win its independence. Understand what nationalism is. Know that nationalism, again, pride in one's country. We had a feeling of nationalism after the War of 1812. We felt like that we could take on just about anybody after we defeated Britain. This happens under President James Monroe. And we're going to feel so good that we're going to issue something known as the Monroe Doctrine, which you see here, basically stating that the whole Western Hemisphere was off limits to European nations. And if they did try to interfere in the Western Hemisphere, that the United States would view that as an act of war. And again, back to our standards, see if you can answer these two standards and give me a good 3 or 4 sentences explaining those answers. So that's going to do it for 2.2, and I will catch you guys on the next one.